Hello, brothers and sisters. Our first reading for this upcoming Sunday comes from the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, he grew up when the Assyrian Empire was losing power. And because of that, Israel experienced a greater degree of freedom than they had in the past. And so King Josiah, he came to power and he renewed the devotion of the people to Yahweh. He tore down the high places, the pagan temples, and he exhorted the people to return to the law. It looked like the people were turning back to Yahweh. It looked like Israel was going to be faithful to the covenant. But as the Assyrian Empire declined, the Babylonian Empire rose. And so Babylon was the threat to the east. And to the west, Egypt was still pretty powerful. And so Israel was caught then between Babylon to the east and Egypt to the west. And so, as a matter of fact, King Josiah, he himself died in a conflict, in a battle between these two empires, right? And so then his successors, they weren't dedicated to Yahweh like he was. And so they lapsed back into idolatry, and the pagan temples were rebuilt, and people didn't follow the law of Moses. And things were getting worse and worse until eventually Babylon came, destroyed Jerusalem, sacked the temple, and took the king and the entire court away in chains. And so that's Jeremiah's background. That's what he's witnessed. That's what he's experienced. He went from this very youthful young period when there was a good king who was trying to do right by the people and by Yahweh, to eventually the destruction of the kingdom by Babylon. And so in response to this experience, Jeremiah, he came to believe that in order for the people to be faithful to the covenant, like it wasn't something that they could do on their own. Rather, the people could only be faithful to the covenant. The people could only respond to Yahweh's blessings appropriately if Yahweh himself, if God himself gave them the strength. And so we hear in our first reading today 4 verses that talks about Jeremiah's hope for this to happen. He hopes that Yahweh will give the Israelites the strength to live by the covenant, to respond to his blessings. And so he prophesies about this great new covenant, about this new covenant that God is going to give. And so what's new about this covenant isn't the information in it. It doesn't tell them anything new about God, and it's not going to have any new rules in it. There's not going to be a new sign like the Sabbath or circumcision. But what's going to be new about this covenant is its promulgation, the way it's made known. Because unlike the old covenant written on tablets of stone, this new covenant, it will be written on the heart by God himself. And because it is written on the heart of humans, they will be able to live by this covenant. They will be able to respond to God's love and his mercy in an appropriate way. Now, 70 years later, the Israelites are freed from Babylon. They return to Jerusalem, they rebuild the temple, and they rededicate themselves to God. And I'm certain that they felt like Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled. They felt like they were entering into a new covenant. But they still struggled with sin. They were still under foreign domination of first the Greeks and then the Romans. And so to find the total fulfillment of Jeremiah's words, we have to look somewhere else. Where should we look? Well, a synonym for covenant is testament. So covenant, testament, they mean the same thing. And so the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy of a new covenant, of a New Testament, is found in our New Testament readings for this Sunday. Because in our readings we find Jesus, and we find Jesus as the one who believes in Jeremiah's words. We find Jesus as the one who believes that only through God's intervention can we be free to live as we ought to. That we can only truly be happy if God himself intervenes in our life. So in our gospel, we find Jesus, who has just ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey, right? He's just days away from his death. And he certainly seems to know what's ahead of him, right? Like he talks about how he's so troubled, and he's like, and we hear about that in Gethsemane as well. But despite how it looks like things are headed downhill, like the authorities are turning against him, he has faith. He trusts in God, that God will make things right. And so, he goes to the Last Supper, and there's this weird stuff with Judas going on. But then, he goes to the garden. He's weeping, and then the Romans come and they seize him. He goes to prison, trusting that God will intervene, right? He's tortured, whipped, beaten, humiliated. He trusts that God will intervene. He takes the cross upon his shoulder, goes up to Golgotha, trusting that God will intervene. And then he dies on the cross, trusting that God will intervene. And then after Jesus shows his obedience to the very end, even in death, then God does intervene, and he makes all things right, and he raises Christ up. And so, these words of Jeremiah, how they're fulfilled in Christ, it makes me wonder, what problems are there in our own lives? What are the things that we're struggling with, where we haven't been having any success? What are these things? And then, cognizant of these struggles, these issues, can we be like Jesus and trust God's timetable to solve these things?